Hi, I'm Prash. What I did want to discuss today was a lot of what is my soapbox, and talking about the resistance to the psychedelic paradigm, to the psychedelic renaissance, if you want to call it that, from within the scientific and medical communities. It's a problem that I face all the time, being my community, and it's something I thought I should bring up for discussion more than anything else. Psychedelic research isn't new. It isn't novel. It isn't revolutionary. Between 1950 and 1970, the US government funded more than 100 trials into psychedelic science. And then, as we all know, 1970 happened, Richard Nixon happened, the Controlled Substances Act happened, and all of a sudden we're criminals. And as a lesser travesty, a whole era of psychedelic science died before us. And yes, there's a resurgence now, and it's exciting. But I still see a distinct discrepancy between the level of evidence that we have and the level of uptake within the scientific and medical communities. And you've got to wonder why that is. Australia is particularly bad. I've spoken at conferences internationally quite a few times. In Australia, within tech conferences, within innovation meetups, but you try and get an audience within a scientific or medical organization or community, and the resistance is palpable. Nigel Strauss and I tried to get a symposium pushed through at the World Psychiatric Association's thematic conference that's in January here in Melbourne. And it's a thematic, well, we got rejected. It's not a surprise. It's a thematic conference. The theme of the conference was innovations in psychiatry. You would think. So why the resistance? Apart from tearing my hair out, spent a lot of time trying to work out why this resistance, why the reasons to the resistance. I found a paper by a guy called Bernard Barber. This is from 1961. And it was I was looking at the resistance by scientists to scientific discovery, which sounds a bit like an oxymoron in terms. I mean, scientists are supposed to epitomize the open nature of questioning. They're supposed to always look towards the future. They're always supposed to be looking to be proven wrong for the betterment of science. But apparently it's not as simple as that. If you're looking at the reasons behind this, there are a couple that he mentions which resonated with me. The first, I guess, is that we're all humans, and scientists are humans too. And as humans, we're essentially homeostatic organisms. We seek to reach equilibrium at all times, whether that's psychological or physiological. And change destabilizes that. It threatens to destabilize that. Secondly, there's the ego. And scientists are very egotistical beings. Scientists hate to be proven wrong. Even more so, scientists hate to be proven wrong by other scientists. And even more so, scientists hate for other scientists to be proven more right than them. Which means that there's a pretty critical, there's a vested interest in being critical of the other, which doesn't really serve the community as a whole, unfortunately. Thirdly, there's the fact that the status quo hold on to the status. By which I mean the people in places of prestige, the people who wield the influence to affect change, are often the people who have the most to lose from said change. They are often also the people who have grown up or have spent the most amount of time in the set paradigms and perspectives of the past, for whom that change is going to be the most confrontational, for whom the discrepancy is going to be the most extreme. Max Planck, whose theories led to the second law of thermodynamics, when he first published those theories, have faced a lot of criticism. And he said, "This experience gave me an opportunity to learn a new fact, a remarkable one in my opinion, that a new scientific truth doesn't triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and are replaced by a new generation that grows up that is familiar with it." I hope that's not what we have to wait for, but it's a relevant point to consider. And the last one, I guess, is preconceived notions. Often new theories fail to gain acceptance because the acceptance and incorporation require a completely new schema or paradigm that is completely not in keeping with the current schema or paradigm. And particularly when we're talking about psychedelics, I think this is quite apparent. There's an obvious role for this reasoning in the psychedelic paradigm, because the psychedelic model of consciousness, for example, sits so completely at odds with the mainstream model of consciousness. It's almost like you're speaking a different language. And When you consider all of these factors, in some ways, you can see the point in terms of why there's a certain level of resistance from within the community. If I was going to list them, we've already discussed the discrepancy in paradigms, the fact that it's almost an insurpassable language barrier to try and traverse. There's the fact that early psychedelic researchers really didn't do us any justice. People like Timothy Leary, and granted, we do owe him a lot, but at the same time, him and his ilk, a lot of the early exuberance led to scientific research that really didn't have the rigor that was required. They were gripped to the sense of urgency that I have within my hands, these substances with untold promise, and I have to get it out into the community as fast as possible. And as a result, I think the research community has suffered because of some of that initial exuberance that didn't quite follow scientific methodology the way the mainstream would like it to. And we're still suffering from that. Fear is a big one. We live in an era of litigation, and as a result, conservatism. And it's really hard to ask a scientist to risk his professional career and go out on a whim to support something or practice something when he isn't going to be supported by his peers, isn't going to be supported by his regulatory bodies. If I go out and give acid to someone, I'm not sure which of my indemnity providers is going to be quite too happy with that. And that is a risk that, even as I speak about this, I am not willing to take, which is a contradiction in terms and a struggle that we constantly battle with. Then there's the abuse of psychedelics, the institutional abuse of psychedelics, the fact that centralized agencies, the CIA, the military, even in Australia, psychiatrists in the past, scream therapy and psychedelics. The history of the abuse of psychedelics by medical organizations is very prevalent in the past, and as a result, the continued skepticism towards any attempt at centralized dispensing or prescription is probably very relevant. It's hard to argue against. And then there's the fact that it's just hard to get it going. I wear this hat so you don't see the dent in my forehead from constantly slamming my head against the wall. But that is the fate of a lot of people who are trying to get psychedelic research up and running in this country. And even if we do get to that point where we get past the legal and legislation barriers, it's still prohibitively expensive, and money is not something that, well, many of us have within the research community here. And even if you do then manage to get it running, the support is poor, supervision is poor, and there are lots of barriers that get between us and getting there. Having said that, though, I don't think it should mean we should just shut up and accept it, and accept what it is for what it is. Scientific curiosity is crucial to the betterment of the profession. And I tend to feel that the phrase that is most detrimental to human progress is because that's the way we've always done it. And yet, that's kind of where we are now because, well, that's the way we've always done it. As such, it's almost a responsibility of the scientific community to ensure that that constant striving for questioning of the status quo is maintained. Most importantly, though, and I come from the point of view of working in the psychiatric profession, psychiatry is rife with conditions that are termed treatment-resistant depression, treatment-resistant personality disorders, or at the very least, treatment-resistive conditions that are really hard to treat, whether that's post-traumatic stress disorder, addiction disorders. How can we truly call something treatment-resistant if we know that there are treatments out there, but we aren't using it? Even from a point of linguistics, it doesn't make sense. And surely we owe our patients, I say we, in terms of the medical community, we owe our patients that moral responsibility to have tried every possible treatment out there before we start to tar them with this brush of treatment resistance. Particularly when we know the evidence is out there. Our patients expected of us to have tried everything. There's a knowledge gap between the medical community and the patients. That's narrowing greatly because of the internet, naturally. But still, our role as the medical community is very much to bridge that gap. And if we are not doing our best to do so, then I think ethically we have failed in our code. Yes, criticism will be leveled at the research that is out there because sample sizes are small. Studies may not have had, at least historically, the same amount of scientific rigor. Early research was of poor quality. And yes, we must own that as a scientific and medical community. We must own that. But surely then the answer is not to ignore it further, but to research it further hasn't that always been the answer? The scientific method is to research it more, and yet there seems to be this circular argument of like, oh, well, we don't know enough. We can't do that. We don't know enough. Well, yes, we don't know enough. So ask the question. So how can we get past these hurdles? I don't think it's my place necessarily to explore that in its entirety. I'm certainly not an authority on the subject, but something I did want to touch on, and I start this with trepidation because I realize that it probably is a contentious point. It's something that's been raised a few times at EGA this year already. Ben Sessa on Monday, Ben touched on this on Monday when he said, yes, you should be able to go into work in your tie-dye t-shirt and a joint behind your ear. You should, but we don't, or we can't, because of the validity that removes from us. And just bemoaning the unfairness of a system that doesn't allow you your civil or cognitive liberties isn't going to affect change. I'm of the belief that if we're going to affect change, the change, at least ideological change and political change, needs to be affected from within the inside, inside the system. If we need to speak to the mainstream, we need to appeal to the people in power, to the people with influence, we need to speak to them in their language, not necessarily ours. Because first and foremost, we need to establish their trust. We need to break down these artificial barriers that already exist, which make them see us as us against them, as opposed to one of their own. The moment we start being seen as this marauding force, then automatically we are less likely to be able to appeal to their minds, and then we've lost the argument, even before we've started. I'm sorry if I do offend anyone in the audience by mentioning we're talking about this, but I've been to a few sort of drug policy reform events, and it's always a great crowd, and they're all my friends, which is why I'm worried about offending people, but I will anyway. But there's a lot of tie-dye, and there's a lot of cannabis smoke, and there's a lot of posters with hemp leaves and proclamations of civil rights. And that's great for raising awareness within our community, within our activist community. But in terms of appealing to the mainstream, in terms of trying to affect ideological change, I don't think the establishment gives a shit. We've been trying that for years. I mean, that picture is the most cliched picture in the book. And it hasn't worked before, and I don't see it working now, because if anything, all it does is connect us back to the stigma of the past. It connects us back to the stigma of the counterculture, when if anything, we're trying to move away from being the counterculture and becoming the culture. And I'm not suggesting that we need to wear suits and write polite letters to your local MP, because we know where those end up. No, but I'm just suggesting that we need to be maybe more circumspect with our enthusiasm, a bit more measured with our activism, a bit more calculated. I think Rick put up a slide in his presentation about Ainslinger and his deputy, how they couldn't wage a war against hippies and blacks, but they could instead wage a war against heroin and cannabis. It was careful and calculated, and it works. We can be as cunning. Yeah. I'm not offering you a suggestion right away, but I'm just suggesting that the sort of blunderbuss approach to battling down the wall of resistance, the same blunderbuss approach that we've reused and reused and reused in the past, I don't think necessarily is the way to go. Particularly in the academic field, the clinical field, and definitely the political field. I do need to feel that we need to fight the battle on their turf with the right tools, or we risk ending up like the Germans at Stalingrad, frozen out, hungry, ill-equipped and cold. Winter is coming. Rug up. Thank you.
I was just interested in relation to my own personal experiences and the nature of psychedelic experiences and the way that they heal. It just seems to me like the relationship between approaching medication, it's sort of like it's a distinctive understanding of the way that the actual healing occurs, because it's more in the realm of removing past conditionings. It's in a very intangible, immeasurable realm. So I'm interested just what your perspective is on that.
I think with psychedelic therapy, the healing occurs on multiple different fronts, and I don't know what is more important than the other. There's the potential for the direct pharmacological impact of the substance. We know it has impacts on serotonin receptors and dopamine receptors and histaminergic receptors, so there's that possible impact. There's the therapeutic relationship with the therapist, which is in itself, that's a healing presence. Then, of course, there's the perspective change and the paradigm shift, the idea that psychedelics don't make you see something new, it makes you see all things in a completely new way. And that paradigm shift is one part of it. And then there's that greater spiritual and transcendental experience. As to which is more important, which is most important, I don't know. As to which is probably more effective in terms of promoting as a means to appeal to the scientific and medical community, focusing on the first three, moving towards from the more tangible to the less tangible, until we've gotten enough critical mass and critical swell of opinion that we can start revealing our true colours.
Yeah, thanks for that. I like the notion of bringing this stuff into the mainstream and almost Trojan horse-like getting into the citadel, because changing the orthodox scientific paradigms will hopefully filter down and have ramifications for the society in general. So as I see it, we're in a kind of Kuhnian paradigm shift, and those beholden to the old paradigm, well, maybe they will have to die off. But as I see it, the important fact is that peak mystical experiences of what psychedelics do, they are phenomena in the world, as real as the trees we see outside there. So the scientific method will have to acknowledge these phenomena and come to terms with them. And the more and more they're studied empirically, then the more and more the establishment will move. They will have to, otherwise they're denying an aspect of reality.
There's one main problem there. You used the word empirically. The problem with a lot of the psychedelic paradigm is that it's a phenomenological construct. And as such, we're limited by this very blunt tool we call language, which is a very, very blunt tool. And it's impossible to really describe the experience in a true way. And the scientific method, which requires empirical evidence, so to speak, struggles with that. It struggles with the intangibility of that experience. And yes, there is evidence, and the evidence is irrefutable, but the evidence is already what we're putting out there. Unfortunately, creating ideological change seems to be only partly about the evidence. A large part of it is about the emotional change. It's about changing the minds, not so much the brains, if that makes any sense. And I think that's where we're struggling. We have the evidence is there, and yet, as you pointed out, the scientific community is still not accepted it. And why is that? I think a lot of it's because they don't necessarily truly believe in it.
In a brief kind of summary way, basic way, would you be able to go a bit more into depth about the serotonin and dopamine and certain chemicals that are released with psychedelic use and the comparison to SSRIs or SDIs or mainstream medications of that realm? Of that realm.
So particularly we're talking about focusing on antidepressants. Without getting too technical, antidepressants frequently work on the serotonin system. And they do so by reducing or increasing the amount of serotonin that sits within your neural synapses and your neural connections. That's a very blunt way in which we understand it. How that actually translates into effect, we actually still don't know. But I didn't tell you that. But we don't. We actually still don't know. We have association, but we don't really have direct causality. Now, in the way psychedelics work, and we always say we actually don't know how psychedelics work. Again, we know we can track receptor profiles, and we can track that there's 5-HT2A release, serotonin release, and some of them have dopaminergic release. We can see the connection to it producing these activation on certain receptors. How that then translates into the phenomenological effect that it has, that connection, we have no idea. We haven't even been able to go in between and look at the hardware and look at fMRI studies, Cart, Harris and crew looking at fMRI studies of where parts of the brain light up. So we know drug goes in, hits that receptor, causes that change in the brain. How that causes the eventual effect, we don't know. That is one of the criticisms that is leveled at psychedelic research, and that you guys don't even know how this thing works. Well, the inside truth is that when it comes to antidepressants and antipsychotics and a lot of psychiatric medications, we don't know either.
I've heard a lot of talk about treatment with depression and PTSD and a few other illnesses, but not much about psychosis or borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, and what you could say about the, goods and bads and stuff about that.
Without
psychedelics.
really having the evidence for it, and I'll preface it with that, I would be very hesitant about giving someone who's psychotic or has a psychotic predisposition even a psychedelic. And again, that is my own conservatism that I have to put my hand up and admit to. So there was a study of 150,000 respondents across the United States, surveying it's a qualitative study looking at drug use and making comparisons to its psychosis. And the eventual result was there's no statistically significant increase in psychosis risk in population that have taken psychedelics as opposed to the general population, which is very reassuring and goes against all past evidence that, Charlie went to a festival and took some acid and then went mad, sort of thing. Well, Charlie had a predisposition to psychosis. And so in people with a psychotic illness or with a predisposition to psychotic illnesses, I would be very reluctant to push that boundary. And I'll admit that's purely my own conservatism, and I don't have enough, there isn't enough evidence as to why that would be the case. When it comes to borderline personality disorder, yes, there are psychotic-like elements that people with borderline personality disorder present with, and that is where there is a possible conflict. But whether, because of the history of trauma that is often indicated in borderline personality disorder, I do see potentially a lot of benefit, but it would have to be in a very measured way. You'd have to pick your setting very, very, very carefully, and exactly when in the phase of someone's illness that you do attempt that. I think that's going to be vital.
And thank you very much, Dr. Prash.